how old does something have to be for it to be on your museum's radar?
A moment. Literally a moment.
Welcome to the Polygamer podcast, where gaming is for everyone. Join us as we expand the boundaries of the gaming community.
Hello and welcome to the Polygamer podcast, episode number 85 for Wednesday, January 9th, 2019. Happy New Year! I'm so excited to be back with another great episode of Polygamer because today we're talking with somebody who I've met many times at the Strong Museum of Play in Rochester, New York. I have donated many various gaming artifacts there, and I'm glad to know that those items will be preserved and made available for years to come, along with hundreds, if not thousands, of other artifacts from throughout gaming history. One of the people making all that possible is today's guest, curator Shannon Symonds. Hello, Shannon.
Hi, thanks so much for having me and also for all those wonderful donations you've been giving us over the years.
You know, many of them are tchotchkes that I received from game publishers during my time as a member of the gaming press, attending E3, etc. And they may be one-of-a-kind items that would just seem a shame to put on eBay and just have somebody else sit on. So I'm glad to be able to give them to the Strong Museum.
Well, we're glad to give them a good home.
Thank you. So there are lots of things I want to talk to you about today. I want to talk to you about your career, about the Strong Museum of Play, and also about your latest gaming exhibit. But let's give all that some context by starting at ground zero. What is the Strong Museum of Play?
So we are actually a very, very unique museum. We are the only museum in the world dedicated to the history and study of play that is also a collections-based museum. We own and care for the world's most comprehensive collection of playthings, so that includes things like dolls, toys, board games, of course, video games, and also we have a huge archive that supports those artifacts with other historical materials related to play. We're up to about 500,000 artifacts as of the end of last year. We keep growing through donors and through support, and we are just really happy to be a home for basically the history of the way people play.
Wow, 500,000. How many of those are on display to the public at any given time?
A very small amount. I would estimate probably somewhere around 10%.
And what is happening with the other 90%?
So we have several very large storage areas, two extraordinarily large ones down in both our basement and upstairs on our third floor. So guests don't usually get to see behind those scenes. But we also have several smaller areas. We have some cold storage specific to things like paper. And of course, we have our library and archives, which is another source of hundreds of thousands of documents.
And those are documents that you make available to researchers?
Yes, both our library and archives and our collection storage areas are open to researchers by appointment. Sometimes people just make appointments because they're doing their own work in the Rochester area, but we also have fellowship programs, and we do have researchers coming to us from all around the world, coming to, say, do work on their PhD dissertation, or perhaps they're professors looking for new classroom material, or looking to publish for maybe an upcoming book or a journal article. So we have lots of people from a variety of backgrounds.
I believe I interviewed one of those researchers. Jimmy Maher of the Digital Antiquarian came all the way from Europe to look at the history of gaming.
Yes, that was wonderful.
Yeah, he has quite the very academic website where he goes through the history of gaming year by year, and he says that some documentation that he wouldn't have found anywhere else in the world was right there in your archives.
Yeah, and that's actually what we really hope to provide for our researchers is basically, you can come here and see things that you can't see anywhere else, repositories of game design documents and company records that they're truly one of a kind, and this is the only place you can find them.
Now, why do people have to travel from all around the world to the Strong when those documents could, for example, perhaps be digitized and made available online?
So there's a couple different scenarios with that. In some cases, it's something that we're working on. There are certainly some things that we're trying to get grants to fund digitization. Something that we're actually working on this year, for example, is we did receive a grant to digitize something called Playthings Magazine, which is basically the biggest repository of the toy industry and how they sell things. It goes back for, I think it was around 100 years old. And we have the most complete collection anywhere in the world. So we actually just received funding to do that, which we're very excited about. So some of it's just honestly a funding problem. Other times we do run into copyright issues. So for example, we do have printed source code from people like Carol Shaw. And we just do not have the licensing to be able to reproduce that in a digital format. We don't own the copyright. And even Carol doesn't own the copyright because it belongs to Atari or to Activision. So in some cases, we simply just don't have the right to do it.
Now, you mentioned Carol and the source code that she donated. Do many of these artifacts you receive, your 500,000 collection, does this come from people who have been in the game industry and from their own personal collections like that?
So we actually do have a large number of archival collections directly from people in the gaming industry. So Carol Shaw is one of them. Jordan Mechner, so for Prince of Persia fans, we are the largest repository of information from the Atari coin-op division. So things like sketches and design documents and corporate records. Ken and Roberta Williams donated their archive from Sierra. So some of them include, handwritten scripts or sketches as well as corporate records and things like that. So things like that we absolutely tend to get from people who are in the gaming industry. Things that are more three-dimensional, so games themselves or merchandising related to them, sometimes those will come from people in the industry. For example, Megan Geyser, who was a former CEO of Her Interactive, when she donated archival papers, she also donated a large number of software, a large number of Nancy Drew games to go along with that. So sometimes we get software from the gaming companies, but other times we just get them from donors. Sometimes it's literally people cleaning out their attic. Other times it's people who just really want to give their older games a good home and know that we're going to preserve them for the long haul.
And sometimes it's you bidding on eBay?
Yes, absolutely. It is sometimes me bidding on eBay. Obviously, we try not to do that because we have, number one, we have a pretty a tight collections budget. So we have to be very careful on what we choose to spend our money on. But also because, getting into a bidding war is sometimes just, there are a lot of collectors out there who will always have more money than we will.
So if somebody listening to this podcast want to donate some of their collection, what is it that you're looking for?
So for people who want to donate, we look at a couple of different factors. Part of it is rarity. So if you have, I'm just going to throw this out there because it's something I'm always looking for. If you have a Calabeth and you would like to donate a Calabeth to me, I would love you forever if you would do that. So sometimes it's just games that are extraordinarily rare. Sometimes it's things that we just are looking to close gaps in our collection. So in general, older PC games on, the floppy disks, those are always good because even if we have them, the media is so at risk that, we might have two copies of something, maybe one stops working, maybe one develops bit rot, and we're actively trying to preserve these and to migrate them onto more stable formats. But, sometimes we just get there too late. So in those cases, even multiple copies can only be a good thing. So
a Calabeth being Richard Garriott's first game for the Apple II, a precursor to Ultima, you don't have a copy?
We do not have a copy, no.
There are only probably, 20 floating around Ziploc bags somewhere?
Yeah, you'd think we could get our hands on one of them.
Right,
So yes, if anyone is listening would like to give me one of those, that would be awesome.
Now, you said that sometimes you just get there too late and things are degraded. The lifespan of floppy disks, they shouldn't work anymore, and yet many of them still do. Mm-hmm. Maybe this is personally motivated, but I've had things removed from my collection against my will, whether it's through parents who just want to clean the house or you lend something to a friend and it never comes back. And 30 years later, I'm still heartbroken over these things. How do you get over showing up a minute too late?
So part of that is the nature of museum work in general, whether it's digital media or it's someone working with ancient Roman artifacts. That's the nature of the beast. You're always going to get to something too late. There's a joke in sort of the industry that we're all still mourning the burning of the Library of Alexandria. Like, some things you just never get over, right? Part of that is just the nature of the game, and you learn to accept it over time. The one thing that's actually really helped us as a team, and certainly me personally, is that we didn't go into this when we first started collecting electronic media, especially. We went into this knowing that we couldn't save everything. It was just going to be impossible. So the best way to get around that is basically to try to save an example or sample representation of as much as we can. So we can't save every single, 5.25-inch floppy disk, but we can save enough so that historians 100 years from now will have a really good idea about what types of games were available on that media and how those played, and the enjoyment that people got out of it. Maybe we have enough documentation for some of those games to show how they were made, how people developed them. So even if we can't save every game, we can save enough to say this is what that generation of games was like. And that's a really big help.
One thing Jason Scott once said is that the hardest part of preserving history is being there when it happens.
Yes.
How old does something have to be for it to be on your museum's radar?
A moment. Literally a moment. We don't, that's actually something that is a very interesting part of being a museum of play, is that time, we work with such timeless things, like play is so timeless that it doesn't matter to us. It's significant whether it's play from 100 years ago or it's play that was just developed literally a minute ago, because the way people play is so similar across different forms that it doesn't matter to us. So when people come to us and say, why is there video game in a museum? Video games aren't old. And we're just like, well, they may not be old, but they're significant. So especially significant to the way people play.
So we know the games that are coming out now are significant, but it's too soon to say if they are historically significant. For example, there are hundreds of Steam games coming out every week. There are new Switch and PS4 games coming out in physical form every week and every month. How do you know which ones to hold on to?
So that's a really good point. And the short answer, of course, is that we don't. I mean, we don't know what's going to become the next Fortnite, that's just time. Time does tell that. So part of it is luck. Usually, so when a new system comes out, because it is expensive, we're not going to go out and, for example, buy, like when the Switch came out, we didn't go out and buy a Switch and every single launch game. We went out and bought a Switch and bought, I think it was like 4 games. So part of it's a guess as to what we think might be the most likely. And you can do that sort of by examining trends, what's popular, what's not. If it's Mario, it's probably going to be timeless. You're going to want a copy of every Mario game if you can. But, we are here for the long haul. So if we do guess wrong, I mean, there usually is the opportunity to go back and get it, especially because things are much more mass produced now than they used to be. Obviously some things are collector's items, and if you don't get it right when they come out, then you're kind of out of luck, or you end up paying an exorbitant price for it. So part of that is a risk, but really we just do the best we can, and again focus on that sort of representative sample rather than being hyper focused on individual titles, especially when we don't quite know the answer to that yet.
Now, libraries keep detailed usage statistics about their books, and if a book is not historically significant and hasn't been lent out in a certain amount of time, they put it out for sale in order to make room for new books. Do you ever deaccession any items in your collection?
Yes, actually, we do have a very formalized deaccession process. We usually go through deaccessioning 3 to 4 times a year. For a museum, an accredited museum as we are, it takes there are a lot of steps to go through it. So, a curator will have to make that call and say, okay, this no longer fits with our mission. So, or it's been damaged over time, or whatever the main reason is, they'll put that forth. Then a deaccessioning committee, which is basically all of the curators and a couple of vice presidents, come together and review the list. And if we see something that we think, we really ought to hang on to that, we can sort of single that out. Once we approve everything, then it has to go to a subcommittee of our board of directors, and then the full board of directors. And then we are able to either offer the objects to other museums, other accredited institutions, either as trade objects or for sale, or we can put them up at certain types of nationally recognized auction houses. So, for example, we can auction off at Sotheby's in New York. And then any money we receive from that has to go directly back into the collection. It can't be used to pay my salary. It can't be used to keep the lights on. It has to go directly back into funding new collections for the museum.
So I'll never be bidding on Strong Museum artifacts on eBay.
That's correct.
So tourists may not be able to get their hands on your artifacts once they're deaccessioned, but surely they would want to go to the museum and get their hands on them, even if they're not researchers. What sort of attractions do you have for typical visitors to your museum who are interested in the history of gaming? Is it more of a hands-on place?
Yes. So as a museum of play, one of the things that we focus on is actual physical playing. So all of our exhibits follow what we sort of call this 3-pronged approach of interpretation, artifacts, and interactivity. So every exhibit is going to have some kind of artifact, which is usually behind, some sort of glass. Those are the museum's actual physical objects that you would be able to touch. Those would have interpretation along with them. So some kind of label or description of what they are. And then each exhibit also has interactivity. So some way to, even if you're not physically interacting with those museum objects, some way to sort of play out whatever those objects are representing. So for example, if you're in, this is non-video game related, but just as an example, our Imagination Destination exhibit, which is all about pretend play. We have costumes and masks, from the 80s, those old plastic Halloween costumes that were so cute and now look really scary. But then we also have a stage, so you can dress up and pretend to be, a theater actor. Our electronic games exhibits are actually slightly different. It's one of the few places where you can interact with actual museum objects. All of our arcade machines that are out are actually accessioned objects. And we made that decision based on a couple of criteria. We have what we call a restricted collection, which are games that are either considered too rare. There's just too few of them. So, for example, Computer Space, there were only a couple hundred of those made. That was the very first commercially produced arcade game. That's always going to be behind glass, because if it gets damaged, those are really, really almost impossible to replace. But say something like a Pac-Man, those are very readily accessible. If something happens, we would be able to replace it fairly easily. And games in particular are meant to really be played. A shut-off arcade machine isn't really that interesting to look at as an artifact. So we do have an arcade conservation technician whose entire job, which is going to sound really awesome because it is basically to keep all of our arcade machines running, but also follow museum level conservation principles to keep them in as original condition as possible.
That does sound awesome, but it also sounds nearly impossible as a lot of those parts are no longer manufactured, and even if they can be 3D printed, it's no longer original.
That's correct. So we do have several suppliers that that's sort of what they do is they make or sell original parts to machines, and we keep them going for as long as we can. But that is a big concern. I mean, for example, CRT monitors are not being manufactured anymore, and we've got a stash of them that we can use in arcade machines when the screens stop working. But eventually they're going to go away. And that's actually a huge quandary for us is, do we replace it with a flat screen monitor and let people continue to play it? Or once that game is gone and we can't find a suitable monitor replacement for it, do we simply just let it stay in its original state but unplayable? And we haven't gotten to that point yet, but we will. And it's a question we're going to have to answer.
It's sort of depressing to know that all these things are fading away.
It really is. It's and so many things are becoming digital. Which is, even in some cases, it makes preservation easier because you only have to worry about the actual files rather than, okay, I have to preserve the electronic component, I have to preserve the case, I have to preserve the manual. But on the other hand, digital distribution makes things so fleeting that literally if you blink, you miss it.
Well, I feel great now, thanks.
Yeah, sorry.
No worries. But you do have some exhibits that are very encouraging and very optimistic, including your latest one, the Women in Games exhibit. Can you tell me a little bit about that?
Yes, so that's been a project that's been near and dear to my heart for a long time, and I'm so grateful that we were finally able to really put that together. Basically, in 2017, the museum launched our Women in Games initiative, and basically what that is it was a desire to tell this story of women in all facets of the game industry. So obviously a lot of that's going to focus on the women who create the games, whether that's developing and programming or contributing music or perform the artwork. All of those aspects that go into making a game, women have been doing it basically since the beginning. So to tell those stories, to tell the stories of the women who are playing the game. And also the exhibit touches briefly on the representation of women in games through the characterization. And it's a tough story to tell sometimes, partially just because the records are not there, and quite frankly, there just simply aren't that. Numerically speaking, there are fewer women making games than there are men making games, and so just finding them in some cases was difficult. But I'm so proud of what we've accomplished and what the institution has put together, and I think we came away with a really strong exhibit.
When you say there are fewer women making games, do you find that to be more true the further back in history you go?
It's funny because if you look at the predecessor to gaming, if you look at actual like typing and things like that, you're looking at something that was very heavily a female dominated job. Data entry was considered a heavily feminized job. But then once it started moving towards things like gaming and entertainment, women were sort of pushed out in favor of their male colleagues. And even to this point, most statistics will tell you that only 22 or 23% of people in game development right now identify as female.
So of that minority percentage, similar question to I asked earlier about games, how do you choose which ones to feature in an exhibit?
So that was really, really hard. The first thing we did when we started the exhibit was to decide, how do we want to display this? Are we going to go chronologically? What format are we going to take? And I sort of decided early on that what I wanted to do was divide it up by sort of position. So, for example, we have a segment on developers and programmers. Sometimes that was a little bit easy for us to focus on bigger names. So I've already mentioned Carol Shaw. She was the first widely recognized female programmer for a major video game distributor, in this case Atari and Activision. In terms of game design, you really can't sort of beat Roberta Williams and the work she did for Sierra and specifically on Graphic Adventures. So there's big names like that. We have a section on audio where we focus on composers, music composers, as well as voice actresses. Again, you sort of start with the bigger names. So Yoko Shimomura, who's done a lot of RPG games with Square Enix. She's probably most famous for Kingdom Hearts, and also recently did Final Fantasy 15. Jennifer Hale, who is again very, very widely recognized as the voice of the female Commander Shepard in Mass Effect. So just sort of throwing names out like that. These are people who, if you're in the game industry, you're going to know who these women are, or at the very least have played the games that they're associated with. So that was sort of our base. And then I kind of looked for women whose names people weren't going to recognize. So, who are some of the, artists. Artists were some of the more difficult ones to find. Just because, sometimes it's hard to actually find credits for artists in general, which I suppose I'd never specifically looked for them before, but in some cases, artists just really aren't credited that much. So we discovered people like Rieko Kodama, who actually worked on some pretty big names for Sega, like Phantasy Star, and she actually did the environments for Sonic and for Alex Kidd. So trying to pull people in with names that they're going to recognize, but then also use that opportunity to educate them with names that they are not going to be so familiar with.
And you do that through a variety of informational displays as well as interactive opportunities to try their games?
Right. So each of those segments that are broken up will have some kind of display. It'll have interpretation in terms of, maybe talking about some of the women that I mentioned, and then there'll be an interactive portion. So another segment that I hadn't mentioned before is writing. So one of the women that we featured very heavily in the writing section was Amy Hennig, who is extraordinarily well known for her work both as writer and creative director on the Uncharted series. So we have some background on her. We have some artifacts out, and then we actually pulled out. In this particular case, we went low tech, and we have an old mechanical typewriter where people can sit down and write the beginning to their own video games, and then submit them in a little Dropbox. For the section on designers and programmers, we have a Centipede arcade machine out for people to play an original Centipede in honor of Donna Bailey, who was a programmer on that.
And do I understand that if visitors think to look up, they might see something?
Yes, that was something that we wanted to do in the space where we are. We've found in that particular exhibit space, the ceilings lend themselves well in general to things hanging down. And in this particular case, each segment is divided by a pillar, and on that pillar, you'll see it's not actually glass, but it's the image of it's plexiglass, but basically a glass ceiling being broken through.
I love it. I love the symbolism. That's fantastic.
Yeah, we were really happy with that.
So you mentioned several of the women who are in your exhibit. It sounds like you're continuing to expand that exhibit based on a recent email exchange you and I had about former Polygamer guest Bahia Khan.
Yes. One of the things that I was disappointed about when we ended up at the end of our exhibit, and also with the panel of guests that we had, which was absolutely phenomenal. We had 10 women here up on stage talking about their experiences, and it was absolutely fantastic. But the one thing that disappointed me at the end was that it was very, very heavily dominated by Caucasian women. And that's something that I felt, especially when we're talking about, we're already talking about sort of a minority in terms of women in gaming. We really need to expand that intersectionality. So not only did I find Bahia's game After Hours incredibly fascinating when I was reading about it, just from the serious nature of it, being about bipolar disorder and things like that. I was also extremely interested in, here she's from South Africa. She's a person of color. She's going to have a much different history in terms of working in the game industry than even her white contemporaries, and that's a side of this story that I'm really, really focused on improving this year.
So your exhibit is still evolving, even though it's open. You're still adding new aspects to it?
So this particular exhibit is set. Basically, we would only change something if there was actually like something physically wrong with it. But this exhibit is temporary. It's open through the spring. It'll come down before our summer exhibit opens in June. And but we are in the midst of a 100,000 square foot expansion to the museum. And that expansion is basically going to be the new home of our International Center for the History of Electronic Games, which I know is a mouthful, which is why we call it ICHEG. But so that's going to be the new home of all aspects of that, of the World Video Game Hall of Fame, of our gaming collection, and also for women in games. So by the time that opens in 2021, my goal is to be able to have an even wider range of artifacts that we can put out for that and that exhibit, and those areas would remain permanent.
That would be awesome. I would love to see more space dedicated to the history of gaming.
Yes, I'm very excited about it.
You mentioned the panel with which this exhibit opened. Was that recorded? I mean, you're a museum of history. I have to imagine it was recorded.
Yes. So we streamed it on our Twitch channel, which is Museum of Play. And we also have a YouTube channel associated with the museum, also under the Museum of Play. And what we did there was the panel started with, we had 10 women, and each of them gave what we called 5-minute micro talks on the theme of inspiration. So what we did in YouTube was we sort of chopped those up into those 5-minute digests. So for people who are looking for, something that's a little bit shorter, or they really want to look at something a particular woman said, we have those. But then we also did save the entire hour and 40-minute long presentation.
That's fantastic. And I'll include a link to that in the show notes found at polygamer.net as well.
Oh, yes, that would be wonderful. I can definitely send you those.
So what is it that you hope visitors to the museum will get from the Women in Gaming exhibit?
I think the one thing, and just to sort of go off on this theme that we talked about with when we had the women in the panel open their talks with this theme of inspire, that's really what this exhibit is about. Whenever we make an exhibit in the museum, we're sort of asked to come up with a one or two words as a takeaway of, if you could have the guests come away with something. Because obviously we can't control how art is interpreted. But if we could, what would we want people to come away with? And I pretty quickly decided that my overarching theme was going to be inspiration. One of the hardest things for women as they try to break into the game industry is a lack of support if they don't already have a network around them. If they're going into college classes and they're the only woman in their game development class, that's very isolating. If they do make it into a studio and, maybe they're the only one of, maybe a handful of women, maybe they've experienced some sexual harassment. Maybe they've just felt ignored. If you don't have that sort of network, that's very isolating and it's very hard to overcome. So what I'm hoping, since our guests do tend to skew towards younger and families, not to say we don't have a lot of adults coming too, especially to the electronic games exhibits. But I want all the little girls who walk through that exhibit who have any sort of interest in video games and technology to sort of look at the exhibit and say, wow, there are a lot of women like me who do that. I can do that too. That sort of inspiration is what I hope people leave with.
That'd be fantastic. And I hope that visitors do see all those exemplars, all those models, all those historical precedents that continue up to this day, and that they see that and we start to shift that minority percentage you and I talked about to be more of a majority if possible.
I hope so too.
So the Women Gaming exhibit has so many inspiring women in it, and there is one inspiring woman in gaming that I would love to talk about. And in fact, I'm talking to her right now, the curator of the Strong Museum of Play.
Well, thank you.
So how is it that you wound up in the history of gaming? From what I understand, this isn't where you thought your career would necessarily go.
No, definitely not. My career path has changed several times since entering college. When I first went to college, I wanted to be a journalist. I wanted to write and take pictures for National Geographic magazine. That's what I wanted to do. That was my dream job. Because I loved writing, and I'm like, well, I suppose I'm not going to be Stephen King, so I guess I can't make a living off writing novels. So the next best thing is to work for a magazine like National Geographic, and I'll get to travel, and I'll get to do all that. I took some photojournalism classes, so I'd be able to back up all my writing with pictures and things like that. And I loved it, and I was gung-ho about it for about 2 years. And then I'm like, wow, the inverted pyramid style of writing is harder than I really thought, and I felt like I didn't have enough scope for the imagination and things like that. So I did still graduate with a bachelor's degree in journalism, but I added a second major. My minor at the time was history, and I loved history so much. And my advisor's like, well, why don't you just turn that into another major? You've got enough time. So I said, okay. And by the time I graduated and I went to grad school, I realized that history was really what I wanted to be doing. I just loved learning about the past. But ironically, for my current job, my love truly was the past. I tended to not be interested in classes that took place, post 1850 or so. I did a lot with ancient civilizations. I did both my undergraduate and graduate dissertations were on the history of Japan. Very interested in the intersection of politics and religion and things of that nature. And in fact, I taught for a very short period of time. And when I did that, it was basically like Civilization 101. So basically, the history up to the 1750, 1800 mark. So that's really where my passion was. But teaching was not something that I decided I was really cut out to do. I didn't have the patience for it. As much as I loved the research, just being up in front of the classroom was just not something that was really conducive to my personality. So I went to my advisor, had a fantastic advisor, and I said, I just assumed that was what you do with a history degree is you go on and you get your PhD and you teach. What else can I do? And she said, well, how do you feel about museums? And I'm like, well, I love museums. I go to them wherever I can. And she's like, well, we've got connections with several local Rochester museums. So let's get you some internships with them. You can do them for credit. So I said, okay. So I interned at 2 museums. One was the Genesee Country Village, which, for those who aren't local to Rochester, is basically like our version of Colonial Williamsburg. It's a living history museum. So I interned there. And then the other one was the Strong Museum. I interned with J.P. Dyson, who's our vice president for exhibits, and also now the ICHEG director. ICHEG didn't exist when I was interning. And between those 2 internships, I'm like, wow, public history this is what I want to do. I immediately knew after just those 2 experiences that I had found my niche. And I was really lucky after I graduated because I had interned here. I was able to get it was a very entry level position. It was a guest relations host. So basically, the people who take care of the exhibits, we dust the glass and, pick up after guests, and we're there to answer questions and find lost children and basically everything that you need to keep the museum running and keep guests happy and just make it a really great experience for people. And I did that for a couple of years. And while I was doing that, I was lucky enough to make connections with people in the curatorial department. And when a grant position opened up for just cataloging, because the museum was taking in so many more objects than they had curators for at the time. They just needed a grant for someone to catalog. I applied and was accepted. And that's kind of how I broke into the curatorial team.
So is that what you would recommend for somebody who wants to go into museum work, is that they get bachelor's and master's in whatever area they're interested in, like journalism or history?
Things are a lot different now, actually. So number one, if I'd known that I wanted to do museum work, I probably just would have focused on history at the time. But now a lot of places have museum studies programs that wasn't nearly so widespread as when I was getting degrees. And in fact, a lot of my colleagues have degrees either in American history or art history or things that are more, I don't want to say generic because it's not like they're generic, but it's become now where you can actually get degrees in museum studies and public history. So for someone who knows that that's what they want to do, I would absolutely go for that. Because again, I mean, my background in ancient Japanese civilization, while helpful and certainly interesting in terms of it taught me how to research and how to write and how to do all of these things that I do now. That particular background isn't as perhaps helpful to cataloging video games as you would think. Although, at least I'm still working with Japanese objects, technically.
That is true. Japanese artifacts, for sure.
Yeah. So yeah, people who are interested in museum work, I would definitely look for universities that have public history and museum studies degrees because they're popping up a lot of places now, which is great.
One of the reasons I ask is because you and I were in college at the same time about 20 years ago, and at the time, my editor told me that if you want to go into journalism, don't major in journalism, major in what you want to write about. I don't know if that advice is still applicable today or if it's applicable to museum studies, but I just thought I'd throw the idea out there.
Yeah, no, I mean, that's certainly an interesting way of looking at it. I mean, I would say for example, if you know that you want to work in a museum specifically about, the history of, U.S. colonization or the American Revolution or something like that, certainly a background in American history would be to your benefit. I think that would certainly be applicable.
A few years ago, again, inspired by the works of Jason Scott, who does not have a degree in this, I thought I would go get one, and I briefly enrolled in a Master's of Library Science program with a specialty in archives. Again, that didn't end up being my forte, kind of like teaching wasn't for you, but I thought that might be a useful skill for someone who's interested in digital history preservation, which was my focus.
Yes, absolutely. And our archivist and our library director and I believe our library cataloger too, I'm pretty sure they all have degrees in library science, and I know at least one of them has done work with digitization as well. So absolutely, I would say that's valuable too.
Oh, good. Nice to know that if I had just stuck with it, I would have been on the right track.
Yeah.
As I mentioned, and as you mentioned, teaching may not have been a good fit. And I think you suggested that you didn't necessarily have the patience for teaching. Mm-hmm. I would think that history also requires quite a bit of patience.
Yes, but it's quite a different kind of patience, I would say. And this is not to say that I'm not that I'm antisocial or not a people person, because that's not true. But working with objects and working with artifacts, you can take all the time you want to look at an object, and it's not going to get tired of you. It's not going to tell you to hurry up. It's not going to tell you that you're doing it wrong. sort of thing. I love interacting with people. I love interacting with my donors, my vendors, and I do actually get to do some educating, usually at a much younger level when we have guests come in, or even when I tour university students. But these are all people who want to be here, who are very engaged. And while I loved my students and teaching was a very it's a very worthwhile profession, and I have always had the highest respect for teachers. And quite frankly, I came away from teaching with even more respect than I had before. It was just not the type of interpersonal communication that was my particular strength.
I don't blame you. I used to teach 11th grade English composition, and I now teach graduate studies at Emerson College in Boston. And while I absolutely love both of them with a passion, they have their challenges.
They really do. And there were every now and then, you get a student who is so fantastic or who comes to you actually just the opposite, and you're able to help them reach goals. And those people left me so fulfilled, and I was so happy to have experienced that with them. And then other times, which unfortunately was more often, you just come home exhausted mentally.
Right. Yep.
So hats off to you and to every other person out there teaching, because you perform an amazing service that I am very jealous of.
Oh, well, thank you. And, there are different levels and kinds of teaching. There's online teaching. There's adjunct teaching. I could never do teaching as a full-time job because it is so demanding and I don't have that stamina. Yeah. But the class I teach, it meets once a week for 4 hours, and that is just the right level for me.
Yeah, that sounds pretty good.
Yeah.
But at the same time, I feel like I get to do a lot of educating here, and I get to preserve things for people to use as educational tools for the long haul. So even though I'm not up in front of the classroom, I still feel like I'm doing educating, and I'm doing it in a way that is much more conducive to my particular personality. So I get a lot of pleasure out of that too.
Oh, absolutely. Museums are invaluable institutions in this country. And here's a statistic that you probably know, but our listeners might not. Which are there more of in this country? Museums, McDonald's, or Starbucks?
Oh my goodness.
Do you know the answer?
I do not. I think I would hope museums are the answer, but my guess is probably Starbucks.
There are more museums than there are Starbucks and McDonald's combined.
Well, that makes me happy.
I know, right?
Happy.
I think there are about 35,000 museums, and Starbucks and McDonald's each have around 15,000.
Okay. Well, that gives me some hope. That makes me very happy. Thank you.
You're quite welcome. I'm glad I could do that for you.
Yes.
So, Shannon, you and I met several years ago when I went to the Strong, which I've been to a couple of times now, and we've collaborated online with various gaming artifact donations, Apple II donations. Most recently, you popped up on my radar and on the latest episode of the Polygamer podcast due to your appearance in the Women in Gaming anthology that Megan Marie wrote.
Yes. Fantastic book. I absolutely love how it turned out. I think it was beyond a lot of people's expectations, including Megan's.
Yes, it's a fantastic book. And as you heard on the latest episode, because you told me you listened to it, she said that when she first approached you, you were a little surprised that she deemed you a good fit for this book. Am I recalling that correctly?
Yeah, so basically what happened was when we were inducting Tomb Raider into the World Video Game Hall of Fame in 2018, we had a woman named Katie who was she was the associate brand manager from Crystal Dynamics, which is also where Megan works. As we were just talking about Tomb Raider and Lara Croft, I mentioned, this is something that we're working on, this Women in Games exhibit, and how excited I am. And she said, let me put you in touch with Megan, who's writing this book on Women in Games. And I thought, great. I was hoping that maybe I could talk to Megan about making contact with some of these women. Maybe I'd get some donations out of it, or at least let some of these women know that the exhibit was happening. So even if they didn't have anything to give, maybe they could, put it out on social media, just get some attention to it, maybe give me some advice on things that I was missing. So I was definitely all gung-ho about that. And while we were talking about these things, she said, well, why don't you fill out one of the profiles? And I said, me? But I don't work. I don't develop games. I don't make games. And part of that, I think, actually going back to our conversation about my prior career might have been a throwback to when I was a journalist, where basically it's sort of like I write the story. I'm not part of the story. I preserve the past. I preserve video game history. I'm not really a part of it. I think that was sort of my mindset at the time. And it's still a mindset that I think I have despite all of this, in some cases when I don't think about it too deeply. So I said, I'm happy to fill it out, but I don't really, I'm not going to be offended if you don't use it, if it doesn't fit with what you're doing. But I will say now, reading the book, I see that she took such a broad stroke of the video gaming industry. So she has the people who are actually making the games and participating in the industry right now. But she also has a game journalist in there. She had a GameStop manager. She has me as a curator. And that actually made me really excited because it shows all the different ways that the gaming industry really has broken into popular culture, which is ironically one of the defenses that we use when people say, well, what makes games so significant? And that it's permeated so much of our society that it's everywhere. You can't help but notice it or even be a part of it. So quite frankly, I learned more about my particular place in the gaming industry from working on that book, and I'm very grateful for that.
Oh, that's fantastic. It sounds like one of the skills you need as a curator is the ability to classify things and to put them into various categories.
Yeah.
And maybe you were viewing gaming as one category when it's actually even more categories.
Yeah, and I mean, we certainly look at gaming with a broad stroke as well. I mean, we say to people, even when they say, I'm not a gamer, we look at them and like, well, do you have a smartphone? Do you ever play solitaire on your computer? What do you, all of that? And it's like, well, yeah, I do that sometimes. And it's like, well, guess what? You're a gamer, whether you know it or not. Yeah. And I mean, I'd always considered myself, part of that. But, and I do, I do game on my own as well. But just in terms of being, if you looking at the table of contents of that book and being mentioned in the same pages as people like Brenda Romero and Carol Shaw and Amy Hennig, these people who I'm honoring in my exhibit, to see my name in the same list is, I mean, not only so humbling and makes me feel so honored, but it's also just sort of a reality check that like, wow, this is, I'm so glad that preservation is being looked at through the same lens of importance as the game development itself. I'm glad that we're being seen as such a valuable service and institution, and that really made me feel so happy and very gratified.
As well you should, because it's very important work you're doing. You've mentioned so many names like Roberta Williams, Donna Bradley, Carol Shaw, and it's due to the work of historical organizations such as yours that we know these names. It's not, otherwise they would just be forgotten to the mist of time because like, oh, this game that nobody's played in years, this game that there's no source code of, no documentation, no design documents. You have all those things and people see these things being preserved and they learn about them, whether they're traveling from all around the world as researchers or just as tourists stopping in Rochester, New York.
Yeah, and it's I think in some ways it's almost sort of like working at Disneyland. Like after a while, even though what you do, in the back of your mind is so important and so magical and brings joy to so many people, at the end of the day, it's still the place that you go to work at every day. And that's why I love giving tours to people into the museum, and especially when we go down into the collections areas, because seeing their expression when we open up those doors and they get to see, the other 90% of our collection and how transfixed and amazed they are, that's every time I do that, that serves as a reminder to me of like, yeah, I really work at an amazing place, and we have such important collections, and I'm so proud to be a part of that. So getting reminders like that is just really, it's a good feeling.
Absolutely, and very validating to let you know that what you are doing does matter. Sometimes you need that from an external source, otherwise you question the impact.
Yeah, absolutely.
Remind our listeners where they can find The Strong and ICHEG, both online and off.
We are located in the middle of downtown Rochester, New York. So if you are ever in the area in upstate New York, we would love to have you stop by. Let us know that you're here. And if you are not in the area or can't make it, you can find us on museumofplay.org. And if you go into our About section, there's a large landing page for ICHEG and also the Women in Games Initiative and all the other awesome things that we're doing.
Fantastic. And again, there will be links to all those in the show notes. Now, I have just one last question for you.
All right.
The Women in Gaming book outed you as a Star Trek fan. And you may not know that I actually host 2 podcasts. Besides Polygamer, I also have a weekly Star Trek podcast all about Discovery.
Oh my gosh, I didn't know that. No.
My friend Sabriel Masson and I co-host it. It's called Transporter Lock, and I would love to know what you think of Star Trek Discovery, season 2 of which premieres just in a week.
So, Discovery has been a very validating experience for me as a Star Trek fan. I completely admit that I am a very old school Trekkie. The original series is my favorite, cheesiness and all. And I was less than impressed with the J.J. Abrams reboot. And Discovery, and I know there's been a lot of contention about it. Discovery to me is definitely bringing back the overarching feel of what I think Star Trek is. It's grittier for sure, but it still leaves you with that bit of hope at the end that there's more out there and that humanity has so far to go, but we're going to get there and we're going to be in a better place.
Wow, I don't think I've heard that particular interpretation, perhaps because among our generation and my experience, most of us got started with TNG, and it's rare to find somebody our age who actually prefers TOS.
Now, see, that actually goes back to the history part. My father, who is also he's a huge history buff, and he gave me my love of history. I started with Next Generation, and when he saw that I was interested in it, he's like, no, you've got 20 years, 25 years of catch up to do. At the time, reruns of the original series were airing on Fox at midnight. I have very clear recollections of this, and we programmed our VCR. That's how far back this was. And we recorded all of those episodes for me to watch. So he made me go in order. And because of that, I came away with such an appreciation for how Star Trek developed. And I'm so grateful for that. But yeah, no, the original is always going to be first for me. And I really do feel like Discovery is tapping back into that for the first time. And since probably, I would say maybe Deep Space Nine for me.
Wow. Yeah, I see how DS9 and Discovery, they're both a little gritty and a little dark. I'm surprised that nothing in between those two met your high standard, though. For example, the 4th season of Enterprise.
So Enterprise had some gems. Enterprise had some absolute gems. I'm a huge, and one of the reasons I probably love Discovery so much is I'm a huge fan, like so many people are, of the Mirror Universe. And
yes.
I actually think that Enterprise had the best interpretation of the Mirror Universe. I absolutely loved what they did with that. So there were absolutely some gems in Enterprise and also in Voyager. I would never deny that, but just sort of as an overarching series with characters that I could truly bond with and really, really get that feel. DS9 was really the last time that happened. I wanted to, getting back to the sort of women in games, I really, really, really wanted to like Voyager with Janeway as the first female captain, and I did. It's not like I didn't like her, but I never got that quite same bonding out of that I did from the earlier shows. So I'm actually very pleased with Discovery.
Yeah, the way I think I would put my two favorite Star Trek series is TNG is the ship I would want to live on, but DS9 is the show with the better stories.
Yeah, I think a lot of people who have been Trekkies for a long time sort of look at TNG as this is the archetype. This is where Star Trek sort of became Star Trek, really. And I can say that without malice, even though the original series is my favorite. Part of that is nostalgia, and I can completely acknowledge that. But TNG has the heart represented best, I think. But DS9 brought in so much of that sort of really human conflict. They weren't afraid to go there, and I think that's what made it it was sort of the black sheep of the Star Trek family for a while, until Enterprise came along, I guess. But yeah, I think those were some really powerful shows. So
I'm sure you're looking forward to TOS characters showing up in the second season of Discovery.
Yeah, I'm interested. I have extraordinarily high standards for Spock, because who wouldn't? Leonard Nimoy was an amazing actor as well as an amazing human being. So I think those are extraordinarily big shoes to fall into. And Zachary Quinto did the best job that he could. As I said, I was not a fan of the Abrams verse at all. So I'm really interested. I've liked the comments that I've seen so far about the director saying this is not the Spock that you're used to, but it's a Spock that is going to grow into the one that you recognize, and I'm excited to see that. We'll see.
Yeah, I'm really looking forward to the second season. I loved the first season, and I'm looking forward to talking about it on Transporter Lock. I hope you'll tune in.
Yes, I absolutely am. It is always awesome to find a fellow Trekkie. We make the world a better place, I like to say.
Well, we are inspired by Star Trek to make the world a better place.
Yes, exactly.
Right. Well, Shannon, thank you so much for your time. This has been a lovely conversation. I really appreciate it.
Well, thank you. Thank you so much. It's been great.
This has been Polygamer, a Gamebits production. Find more episodes, read our blog, or send feedback at polygamer.net.
I did an interview a couple of years ago with the Charles Babbage Institute, and they said that one of the things they collect are the unedited audio recordings of interviews.
Oh my goodness, that's got to be fascinating.
It must be. From your perspective, I am sure that is fascinating. From my perspective, it's terrifying.
Oh, yes. Yes, I can see that. Yes. Because,
the podcast that you and I are going to release is going to be edited. Would you really want somebody hearing what it sounded like before I edited it?
I mean, certainly as someone being interviewed, or even from your perspective being the interviewer, definitely not. But as a historian, yes. So I guess it depends on which hat I'm wearing.